My name is Sierra Blackwood. I am 27 years old, and on the night of December 12th, my father effectively erased my existence from the Blackwood dynasty with the same clinical precision he used to dismantle hostile takeovers. The setting was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, specifically the Temple of Dender, where the ancient sandstone blocks were bathed in a cold, ethereal blue light that made the evening feel more like a high society funeral than a celebration of Blackwood Legal's 30th anniversary. I remember the exact weight of my dress, a custom-made silk gown in emerald green that cost more than most people's annual rent, and the way the glass ceiling reflected the city's indifferent stars above us. My father, Sterling Blackwood, stood at the mahogany podium with the poise of a Roman emperor, his silver hair catching the light as he surveyed the crowd of 215 elite attorneys, federal judges, and Manhattan power players. At exactly 10:14 p.m., the air in the room seemed to solidify into ice as he adjusted the microphone and delivered a sentence that would reverberate through the legal tabloids for months. Sierra is choosing to unite her life with a man who carries the stench of failure and a child that isn't even hers, he declared, his voice projected through a state-of-the-art Bose sound system that ensured every syllable reached the furthest corners of the gallery. As the senior partner of Blackwood Legal, I refused to let my legacy be diluted by charity cases. He didn't look at me as he said it. He looked at the crowd, inviting them to share in his aristocratic disdain, effectively severing my ties to the family empire while I stood frozen next to a tray of untouched beluga caviar blinis. I am a high-stakes corporate auditor, a profession built on the meticulous analysis of truth versus deception, yet I had never seen a more blatant act of public execution than what my father performed that night. I was 2 weeks away from marrying Julian, a 34-year-old landscape architect whose hands were often stained with the rich earth of the gardens he designed, a stark contrast to the sterile, ink-smudged fingers of the men I grew up with. Julian was a widower, a man who had navigated the devastating loss of his first wife with a grace that my father would never understand, and he was the father of Maya, a 5-year-old girl with tangled chestnut curls and a laugh that could shatter the suffocating silence of the Blackwood estate. To my father, Julian was a failure because he didn't pursue a 7-figure salary in a glass tower, and Maya was a charity case because she didn't share the Blackwood bloodline, a concept he guarded with a medieval obsession. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat too long, the only sound being the distant hum of the climate control system keeping the ancient Egyptian artifacts at a precise 72 degrees. I felt the collective gaze of 200 people turn toward me, a mixture of pity and predatory curiosity, as the realization set in that the heiress to the Blackwood fortune had just been stripped of her crown in front of the very peers she was supposed to lead. But to truly understand the depth of this betrayal, I must take you back to the clinical, cold reality of my upbringing in our 3-story penthouse on the Upper East Side, where affection was a performance and love was a line item on a balance sheet. Growing up as Sterling Blackwood's only daughter meant living under the constant shadow of a black 2024 Cadillac Escalade that waited at the curb every morning to whisk me away to elite private schools where I was expected to be nothing less than the top of my class. My father didn't measure success in happiness. He measured it in billable hours and the acquisition of prestigious titles. When I chose to become a corporate auditor instead of joining the firm as a litigator, the rift began to form, a hairline fracture in the porcelain facade of our family. He saw my career choice as a betrayal of his legacy, a refusal to wield the Blackwood name like a weapon in the courtroom. He believed that by scrutinizing the financial failures of others, I was admitting a lack of the killer instinct required to build something of my own. He never understood that my work required a different kind of strength, the ability to see through the smoke and mirrors of corporate greed to the rot underneath, a skill I was now using to see the rot in my own father's soul. The contrast between my world and Julian's was like moving from a monochromatic film into a world of hyper-saturated color. I met him when he was hired to redesign the rooftop garden of the auditing firm where I worked, a project that required him to spend weeks on the terrace overlooking Central Park. While I was buried in spreadsheets and tax filings for a Fortune 500 tech company that was hiding $40 million in offshore accounts, Julian was meticulously selecting Japanese maples and creeping thyme. I remember watching him through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my office, noting the way he spoke to his crew with respect and the way he looked at a struggling sapling with more genuine concern than my father had ever shown me during a flu. He drove a 2018 Toyota Tundra, a rugged, mud-splattered vehicle that looked out of place in the sea of polished Porsches and Mercedes-Benzes in the parking garage, and he carried the scent of cedar wood and rain. When he finally asked me to coffee at a small independent shop in Chelsea where the baristas knew his name, I realized I had spent my entire life around people who were famous but had no friends. Julian's life was defined by the presence of Maya, a child who had become the center of my universe in a way I never expected. My mother, Eleanor Blackwood, who lived her life in a haze of expensive gin and Pilates classes, had warned me that being a stepmother was a thankless job for those who couldn't achieve their own success. But when I first met Maya at a playground in Riverside Park, she handed me a wilted dandelion like it was a gold medal and told me my eyes looked like the ocean. She didn't care about my last name or the fact that I could calculate a company's burn rate in my head. She cared that I knew the lyrics to every song in her favorite animated movies and that I didn't mind getting sand in my expensive leather loafers. To my father, this was the ultimate dilution of the Blackwood brand. He saw me attending preschool orientations and buying character-themed lunchboxes as a waste of a $300,000 education. He viewed my commitment to a child who wasn't his biological grandchild as a personal insult, a sign that I was choosing a common life over the rarefied air of the elite. On the night of the gala, the air in the Metropolitan Museum was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that made me feel nauseous even before my father took the stage. I had spent the afternoon at a high-end bridal boutique on Madison Avenue, the kind of place where they serve champagne in crystal flutes just for trying on a veil. I was looking at a Vera Wang gown that cost $24,000, feeling a sense of guilt because Julian and I were planning a wedding that was supposed to be about us, not the price tag. I had invited my father to the final fitting, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between our worlds, but he had sent his administrative assistant to decline, citing a conflict with a merger meeting. That should have been my final warning. He had spent the last 6 months trying to bribe Julian to leave me, offering him lucrative landscaping contracts for Blackwood Legal's various estates on the condition that he disappear from my life. When Julian refused, my father transitioned from bribery to total warfare. The speech at the gala was his nuclear option. As he stepped down from the podium, the room remained in a state of suspended animation. My mother sat in the front row, her face a mask of Botox and carefully applied foundation, refusing to meet my eyes as she adjusted her Cartier Panthère bracelet. She was the silent accomplice to his cruelty, a woman who had traded her soul for a zip code and a seat at the right tables. I stood my ground, my hands trembling slightly against the silk of my skirt, but I kept my chin up. I thought about the house Julian and I were renovating in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, a brownstone with a mortgage that we paid with our own hard-earned money, not a trust fund. I thought about the bills I had seen on Julian's desk, the reality of a landscape architect's income during the winter months, and the way we carefully budgeted for Maya's private kindergarten tuition, which cost $32,000 a year. We weren't the failures my father claimed we were. We were real people living a real life, something Sterling Blackwood hadn't done in decades. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the stone floor in a rhythmic cadence that sounded like a countdown. I didn't stop to talk to the partners who had known me since I was a child, the men who had given me internships and patted me on the head while secretly hoping I'd never be their boss. I didn't look back at the Temple of Dender, a monument to a civilization that had collapsed under the weight of its own ego, much like the family I was leaving behind. I stepped out into the crisp December air, the temperature hovering around 34 degrees, and waved for my driver. But then I stopped. The Escalade was no longer mine. The driver, a man named Marcus who had driven me for 5 years, looked at me with a profound sadness as he pulled away, following the orders he had undoubtedly received via a text message the moment my father finished his sentence. I was alone on Fifth Avenue, the wind whipping through my silk gown, but for the first time in 27 years, I could breathe. I pulled my phone from my clutch and called a rideshare, watching as a humble silver Honda Civic pulled up to the curb to take me away from the museum and toward a future that didn't include a mahogany podium or a legacy of cold, calculated cruelty. My name is Sierra Blackwood, and while I may have lost a fortune at 10:14 p.m., I had finally found the one thing my father could never audit: my own worth. Standing on that sidewalk, I realized that family isn't the name engraved on a building or the blood that flows through your veins by accident of birth. Family is the person who chooses to stand by you when the lights go out and the world turns its back. As the rideshare pulled away from the curb, I looked at the shimmering lights of the city and knew that the story of the Blackwood legacy was ending. But the story of Sierra, Julian, and Maya was only just beginning. The contrast between my father's existence and my own was not just a difference in tax brackets. It was a fundamental divergence in the definition of human value that made me feel physically ill whenever I had to cross the threshold into his world. My father, Sterling Blackwood, presides over a $68,000 penthouse on Park Avenue, a sprawling monument to excess where the monthly homeowner association fees alone are $3,200, a sum that exceeds the total monthly mortgage and insurance on the modest Brooklyn brownstone Julian and I are fighting to call our own. In that penthouse, the floors are polished white Carrara marble that feels like walking on ice, and the air is filtered through a custom HVAC system that ensures not a single speck of the city's grit ever touches his collection of first edition legal treatises. He moves through his life armored in $4,500 Brioni suits, tailored so precisely that they don't even wrinkle when he sits, and he drinks 25-year-old Macallan Sherry Oak single malt scotch, like it is nothing more than common tap water, swirling $300 worth of liquid in a Baccarat crystal glass while discussing the unfortunate necessity of laying off 300 employees to protect the firm's profit margins. I, on the other hand, have spent the last 5 years navigating the potholed streets of the 5 boroughs in a 2017 Toyota RAV4 in magnetic gray metallic with 94,000 miles on the odometer, and a faint scent of old coffee and Maya's discarded apple slices lingering in the upholstery. While my father's world is one of hushed elevators and private drivers, mine is defined by a 600-square-foot walk-up in Brooklyn where the radiator clanks rhythmically every morning at 6 a.m. and the stairs groan under the weight of my groceries as I climb to the 4th floor. The financial chasm between us was a deliberate choice I made to preserve my sanity, though my father viewed it as a pathetic form of martyrdom. I paid every single cent of my $112,000 MBA at NYU Stern myself, working 40-hour weeks as a junior analyst while taking night classes, surviving on takeout noodles, and the grim determination that I would never owe Sterling Blackwood a single favor that he could later use as leverage against my soul. I remember the day I graduated, looking at my student loan balance and feeling a perverse sense of pride in that debt, because it was mine, an honest burden, while my father spent $85,000 that same year just on country club memberships at Sleepy Hollow and the Maidstone Club in East Hampton. He saw those fees as investments in networking, the price of admission to the inner sanctum where men in embroidered polos decide the fate of the local economy over 18 holes of golf, whereas I saw them as the equivalent of a down payment on a house that he threw away just to ensure he was surrounded by people as wealthy and hollow as himself. The sheer vulgarity of his spending habits became a constant, silent scream in my mind whenever he would lecture me on the discipline of capital, his voice dripping with the condescension of a man who had never looked at the price on a grocery store shelf in 40 years. However, the most unforgivable manifestation of his arrogance was the way he spoke about Julian, a man whose character was forged in a fire my father wouldn't survive for a single day. Sterling had the audacity to call Julian financially illiterate during a tense dinner at Le Bernardin, where the tasting menu cost $400 per person and the wine pairing was more than Julian's monthly truck payment. My father leaned across the starch-white linen and sneered that a man of 34 should have more to show for his life than a mid-range pickup and a small-scale landscaping business, completely ignoring the fact that Julian had spent his entire life savings, exactly $244,000, trying to keep his late wife, Sarah, alive during her brutal 3-year battle with lupus. Julian hadn't lost that money on bad stocks or frivolous luxuries. He had poured it into experimental treatments, specialized home care, and out-of-network specialists at Johns Hopkins when the insurance company decided that Sarah's life was no longer a cost-effective investment. He had sold his previous home, emptied his 401k, and worked 16-hour days until his hands bled just to buy her 3 more months of being able to hold her daughter, Maya. To my father, that sacrifice was a mathematical error, a sign of a man who allowed emotion to cloud his fiscal judgment, because in Sterling's world, everything, even the life of the mother of your child, is subject to a cost-benefit analysis. I sat there in that restaurant, watching my father pick at his Wagyu beef, and I realized that he viewed Julian's poverty as a moral failing rather than a badge of honor. He couldn't comprehend a love so profound that it would render a bank account balance irrelevant, because my father has never loved anything that couldn't be audited and appraised. He looked at Julian and saw a man who had failed to protect his assets, while I looked at Julian and saw a hero who had sacrificed everything to protect a person's dignity. The irony was suffocating. My father, who had inherited the seeds of his empire and grew them through ruthless litigation, felt he had the right to judge a man who had built a life out of sweat, dirt, and devotion. Julian's landscape architecture business, Greenhaven Design, was small because he refused to take on debt he couldn't personally guarantee, and he paid his 3 employees a living wage of $28 an hour with full benefits, even when it meant he didn't take a salary for himself that month. He was a man of integrity in a world of fine print, a man who understood that a person's legacy isn't written in a will, but in the shade of the trees they plant for a future they might not see. My father's obsession with diluting the legacy was really just a fear of losing control over the one thing he couldn't buy: my obedience. He hated that I walked to the subway in my $300 suits from Aritzia while he sat in the back of his chauffeured Escalade, and he hated even more that I seemed happier in my cramped Brooklyn kitchen than he ever was in his Park Avenue mausoleum. He looked at Maya, who was wearing a $20 dress from Target and playing with a set of wooden blocks, and he didn't see a granddaughter. He saw a financial liability, a child who would eventually want a piece of the Blackwood estate without having the right genes to justify it. He had spent my childhood teaching me that the world was a series of transactions, that you only gave what you could afford to lose, and that the greatest sin was to be a charity case. But as I looked at Julian, who would walk through fire for me and Maya without asking for a receipt, I realized that my father was the one who was truly bankrupt. He was a man with a 6-figure wine cellar and a 7-figure art collection, yet he was so spiritually poor that he had to use a public gala to try and break his own daughter's heart. The weight of this realization settled in my chest like lead as I remembered the long nights I spent at my desk in Brooklyn, auditing the books of multinational corporations and seeing the same cold, calculating patterns of behavior that defined my father's life. I saw how they moved money to hide their mistakes, how they treated human beings as human capital to be depreciated over time, and I realized that I had spent my career learning how to spot exactly the kind of man my father was. Every time I looked at my 2017 RAV4, I didn't see a stench of failure. I saw a vehicle that was paid for, a car that took me to soccer practices and grocery runs and weekend trips to the Catskills where Julian and I would dream about the future. I didn't care about the Brioni suits or the Macallan or the private clubs because I knew the cost of those things was a soul that had been bartered away long ago. Standing in the aftermath of his speech, I knew that my father's rejection was actually my liberation. He thought he was taking away my future by disinheriting me, but he was actually giving me the one thing he could never afford, the freedom to be a Blackwood who wasn't defined by the Blackwood name. He could keep his millions, his penthouse, and his cold, empty legacy. I had 244,000 reasons to be proud of the man I was marrying, and a lifetime of Brooklyn mornings to prove that a small, crowded home is worth more than a glass tower built on a foundation of lies and discarded hearts. The stench he claimed to smell wasn't failure. It was the scent of a life actually being lived, of dirt and sweat and tears and the messy, beautiful reality of a family that chooses each other every single day, regardless of the balance in their checking accounts. My father would die in a suit that cost more than a car, surrounded by people who were only there for the free scotch, while I would live a life filled with the chaotic, expensive, and glorious love of a man who knew that some things are worth every penny of a life's savings, even if it leaves you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a child's hand in yours. The betrayal reached its agonizing, hyper-calculated peak during what my father chillingly referred to as a family strategy meeting, held within the suffocatingly opulent walls of a private suite at the Plaza Hotel. The room was a masterclass in aggressive wealth, featuring gold leaf crown molding, heavy silk drapes, and a shade of champagne that seemed to mock the dire nature of the conversation, and a massive mahogany table that felt like a barrier between my soul and the people who shared my DNA. My mother, Beatrice Blackwood, was a portrait of practiced indifference, draped in a $12,000 Oscar de la Renta cocktail dress in a shade of midnight navy that matched the coldness in her eyes. She didn't acknowledge my presence with a greeting or even a nod. Instead, she focused her entire being on the meticulous task of peeling a single green grape with a silver fruit knife, her movements precise and detached as if she were performing surgery. The silence in the suite was punctuated only by the faint clink of the knife against the fine bone china and the distant, muffled roar of Manhattan traffic 18 floors below us on Central Park South. My father didn't waste time with pleasantries or the illusion of familial warmth, reaching into his leather Toomey briefcase and withdrawing a 15-page document bound in a sleek black cover. He threw the risk assessment report onto the center of the table with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The title printed in bold, clinical font, as if my fiancé were nothing more than a failing subsidiary in a hostile takeover bid. I reached out with trembling fingers to flip through the pages, and my breath hitched as I realized the depths of the invasion of privacy my father had commissioned. The report was a forensic autopsy of Julian's life, featuring a detailed analysis of his financial history, including his credit score of 642, which was highlighted in red ink as if it were a scarlet letter of moral failure. To my father, that number was a definitive verdict on Julian's worth as a human being, ignoring the fact that it was the result of a man choosing to exhaust every line of credit he possessed to pay for his late wife's chemotherapy and specialized palliative care. The report even included high-resolution surveillance photos of Julian's modest 3-bedroom house in Queens, a charming but weathered colonial with peeling white paint on the shutters and a front porch that needed structural reinforcement. There were photos of his 2018 Toyota Tundra parked in the driveway, its bed filled with bags of organic mulch and garden shears, and a shot of Maya's colorful plastic slide sitting in the backyard next to a patch of overgrown clover. "You're marrying a debt, Sierra, not a man," my father sneered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that I had heard him use only when he was about to bankrupt a competitor in court. He leaned forward, the scent of his expensive cologne, a custom blend that cost $700 an ounce, filling the space between us like a poisonous cloud. He spoke of Julian as if he were a parasitic infection that had latched onto the Blackwood legacy, a financial liability that needed to be liquidated before it could contaminate the family's pristine balance sheet. My sister Paige, who sat to my right, let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes, which were as sharp and predatory as my father's. She adjusted the 3 $9,000 Cartier love bracelets that circled her wrist, the gold clinking together with a sound that reminded me of handcuffs, and she caught my gaze with a smirk that was dripping with a toxic blend of pity and malice. "Maybe she just likes the poverty aesthetic," Paige whispered, her voice airy and mocking as she leaned back in her velvet-upholstered chair. She had spent her entire life following my father's script, marrying a hedge fund manager whose family owned a vineyard in Tuscany and whose only concern was whether their summer house in the Hamptons had a high enough hedge to block out the sight of the commoners. To Paige, Julian's struggle wasn't a testament to his character or his capacity for love. It was a fashion choice, a quaint rebellion that I was staging to get attention. She looked at the photos of the house in Queens with the same expression one might use to look at a piece of roadkill, her diamond earrings catching the light and casting tiny, dancing fractures across the risk assessment report. I felt a surge of hot, blinding anger rising in my throat, a physical reaction to the absolute lack of empathy in the room. But I forced myself to remain still, my years of corporate training kicking in as I looked at the three of them and realized they weren't a family. They were a board of directors deciding which assets to strip. The smell of the room was becoming unbearable, a cloying, heavy scent of expensive white lilies that had been arranged in a massive crystal vase in the center of the table. They were perfectly bloomed, their waxy petals pristine and white, but to me, they carried the unmistakable odor of a funeral. It was the funeral of any hope I had left that my parents could be reached, the final burial of the illusion that they might actually care about my happiness more than they cared about the perceived prestige of the Blackwood name. My father began to outline the restructuring he demanded, which included a prenuptial agreement so restrictive that it would essentially turn Julian into a tenant in his own life, and a clause that would require Maya to be sent to a boarding school in Switzerland to be properly socialized away from the influence of her father's middle-class roots. He spoke about these things with a flat, bureaucratic tone, as if he were discussing the terms of a lease agreement for a commercial warehouse. He offered me a choice. I could sign the papers and remain the heiress to a fortune that included the Park Avenue penthouse and a 40% stake in Blackwood Legal, or I could walk out of the room with nothing but the clothes on my back and the keys to my aging Rave 4. The hyper-realism of the moment was jarring. I noticed the way my mother's silver fruit knife caught the afternoon sun, the way a small bead of grape juice had stained the Oscar de la Renta silk, and the way my father's jaw remained perfectly set as he waited for my submission. I looked at the 15-page report again, specifically at a photo of Julian holding Maya on his shoulders in front of that modest house in Queens. He was laughing, his eyes bright with a joy that my father would never experience in his lifetime, and Maya was wearing a lopsided birthday crown made of construction paper and glitter. That photo, meant to be an indictment of Julian's failure, was actually the greatest proof of his success. He had built a home filled with warmth and safety on a foundation of $244,000 worth of sacrifice, while my father had built a mausoleum out of marble and lies. I realized then that my father's credit score for his own soul would be a 0, a total default on the only currency that truly matters at the end of a life. I stood up slowly, the silk of my dress rustling against the chair, and I didn't look at the report or the legal documents my father had spread out like a trap. I looked at my mother, who had finally finished her grape and was now patting her lips with a linen napkin that cost more than Julian's weekly grocery budget. She still wouldn't look at me, her eyes fixed on some point on the far wall, perhaps calculating the social cost of having a daughter who chose a landscape architect over a legacy. I looked at Paige, whose smirk was beginning to falter as she realized I wasn't going to cry or beg for her approval. And finally, I looked at my father, Sterling Blackwood, a man who believed that everything in the world could be bought, sold, or audited into submission. I told him that he was right about one thing. I was marrying a man who carried the weight of a significant debt, but that debt was a testament to his capacity to love, a burden he carried with more dignity than my father carried his billions. I informed them that I would not be signing their documents, and that as far as I was concerned, the family strategy meeting was adjourned permanently. I walked toward the heavy oak door of the suite, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my steps were firm. As I reached for the handle, I heard my father's voice behind me, no longer sneering but cold and final, telling me that I was making a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. He warned me that the world didn't care about love when the bills were due, and that I would eventually come crawling back to Park Avenue when the reality of Julian's poverty became too much to bear. I didn't turn around to answer him. I stepped out into the hallway, the plush carpet muffled the sound of my departure, and the scent of those funeral lilies finally began to fade. I took the elevator down to the lobby, moving past the tourists and the golden bellhops, and walked out into the biting New York air. I didn't need a 15-page report to tell me who I was or what my life was worth. I had a 2017 RAV4 waiting for me in a parking garage 3 blocks away, a man in Queens who loved me for my mind and not my pedigree, and a 5-year-old girl who was waiting for me to help her finish a puzzle. As I stepped onto the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, leaving the plaza and the Blackwood legacy behind, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The funeral was over, and for the first time in 27 years, I was the one who was truly alive. My father could keep his reports and his scores. I was going home to a house where the paint might be peeling, but the foundation was made of something that even Sterling Blackwood couldn't audit. a love that owed nothing to anyone but ourselves. That night, while the rest of the city slept under the deceptive glow of streetlights and neon signs, I sat at my scuffed IKEA mom desk in the corner of my living room, the silence of my Brooklyn walk-up feeling heavier than it ever had before. It was precisely 03:02 a.m., a time when the world feels suspended between the mistakes of yesterday and the fears of tomorrow, and I found myself staring into the steam rising from a cold cup of burnt coffee that had long since lost its warmth. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury afforded to those who still believe in the fairness of the world, and after the clinical execution I had witnessed at the Plaza Hotel, I knew that grief was a secondary emotion to the cold, hard clarity of purpose. I opened my MacBook Pro, the fan whirring softly in the quiet room as the screen illuminated my face with a harsh blue light that felt like a surgical lamp. My fingers moved with a muscle memory I hadn't realized I still possessed as I navigated to the hidden login portal for the Blackwood Legal Internal Expense Server. It was a digital vault I had helped organize during my grueling 2-year stint as their junior auditor, a time when I was desperate to prove my worth to a father who viewed my attention to detail as a tool for his own enrichment. They had never revoked my administrative credentials, likely due to a mixture of arrogance and the assumption that a disinherited daughter would be too broken to fight back. And as the progress bar flickered and green text appeared on the screen, I felt the digital gates of the Blackwood Empire swing open for me one last time. I spent the next 4 hours immersed in the grayscale reality of spreadsheets and ledger entries, my eyes scanning through thousands of lines of data with the predatory focus of a high-stakes auditor who had finally found the thread that could unravel a masterpiece of deception. I began cross-referencing their prestigious pro bono filings, the very documents my father used to secure humanitarian awards and favorable press in the New York Law Journal, with their actual internal bank transfers from the firm's operating accounts at J.P. Morgan Chase. The deeper I dug into the subledgers, the more the smell of expensive lilies from the plaza seemed to be replaced by the metaphorical scent of rot and old ink. I was looking for the delta between the hours they claimed to be spending on public defense work for the city's indigent defendants and the actual resources they allocated to those cases. By 04:30 a.m., the pattern emerged with a sickening regularity that made my hands go cold. They weren't just padding the hours. They were systematically manufacturing a narrative of civic duty while secretly siphoning funds from the city's treasury to cover the overhead of their private, high-margin litigation. It was a sophisticated overbilling scheme that targeted the very system my father claimed to uphold, a betrayal of the public trust that was executed with the same surgical precision he had used to cut me out of the family will. The technicality of the fraud was breathtaking in its audacity, as they had created a series of shellcodes within their billing software to categorize administrative lunches, luxury travel, and even personal country club expenses as necessary legal research for their pro bono obligations. I pulled up the billing records for a specific case involving a tenant dispute in the Bronx, where Blackwood Legal claimed to have spent 212 hours of senior associate time, yet the internal calendar showed those same associates were actually in the Hamptons for a firm retreat on those exact dates. By the time the sun began to cast a pale gray light over the rooftops of Brooklyn at 06:15 a.m., I had moved from suspicion to absolute certainty. I began downloading the evidence, my cursor clicking with a rhythmic, lethal intent as I gathered the metadata, the internal emails discussing margin optimization in the pro bono department, and the scanned copies of the altered invoices sent to the City of New York's Department of Finance. Every document was a brick in a wall I was building to cage the man who thought he could discard me like an outdated piece of office equipment. By exactly 0700 a.m., just as the first sirens of the morning commute began to wail in the distance, I had compiled a digital folder containing 128 separate PDF files, a comprehensive dossier of white-collar criminality. These files provided undeniable proof that Blackwood Legal had been systematically overbilling the city for public defense work to the tune of $812,000 over the last 4 years alone. I stared at the folder, named simply Audit Project Final, and realized that this was the true inheritance my father had given me. The ability to see the ugly truth hidden behind beautiful numbers. He had spent my life telling me that Julian carried the stench of failure, but as I looked at the evidence of his own greed, I realized that Julian's $244,000 debt was a holy sacrifice compared to the $812,000 my father had stolen from a city that was already struggling. My father wore $4,500 Brioni suits paid for by the very people he looked down upon from his Park Avenue penthouse, and his legacy wasn't built on excellence or brilliance. It was built on the quiet, calculated theft of public resources meant for the most vulnerable members of society. The realization that I held the power to dismantle his entire world in a single upload was a heavy, intoxicating weight that settled in the pit of my stomach. I thought about the risk assessment report he had thrown on the table at the plaza, the way he had mocked Julian's credit score and our modest home, and I felt a cold surge of triumph. My father had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators to look into my life, but he had forgotten that I was the one who knew exactly where the bodies were buried in his own financial garden. I sat there in my $12 pajamas from Target, my hair messy and my eyes burning from the screen glare, and I felt more powerful than I ever had while wearing emerald silk and pearls. I wasn't just a corporate auditor anymore. I was the ghost in his machine, the error in his ledger that couldn't be erased or accounted for. Every one of those 128 files was a testament to the fact that you cannot audit a person's soul without finding the debts they owe to the world. I meticulously organized the folder, creating a summary memorandum that outlined the exact methodology of the fraud, citing specific tax codes and municipal statutes that had been violated. I included the bank routing numbers, the timestamps of the fraudulent entries, and the electronic signatures of the partners who had authorized the transfers, ensuring that there would be no room for plausible deniability. This wasn't just a collection of documents. It was a forensic roadmap to my father's downfall, a path I had cleared through the thicket of his lies using the very skills he had forced me to master. I thought about the Winter Gala and the way he had invited 200 of his peers to witness my public execution, and I realized that the true charity case in the Blackwood family was Sterling himself, a man who survived on the stolen wealth of others because he was too morally bankrupt to earn a living with integrity. As I took the final sip of my cold, bitter coffee, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The betrayal at the plaza had been the end of my life as a Blackwood, but this night was the beginning of my life as Sierra. I wasn't doing this for revenge, though revenge was a sweet, lingering aftertaste. I was doing it because for the first time in 27 years, I had the power to balance the scales. I looked at the clock on my computer screen, 0704 a.m., and I knew that the working day was about to begin for the city's district attorneys and the federal investigators who handled municipal fraud. I didn't need a luxury SUV or a Park Avenue address to be heard. I just needed the truth and the courage to hit send. I moved the cursor to the share button, my finger hovering over the trackpad as I thought about Julian and Maya sleeping soundly in our little house in Queens, unaware that the woman they loved was about to set fire to an empire to protect their future. "Family isn't who shares your blood," I whispered to the empty room. "It's who stands up for the truth when everyone else is busy polishing the lies." With a single, deliberate click, I unleashed the $812,000 ghost of my father's greed into the world. And as the upload complete notification appeared on the screen, I finally closed my laptop and watched the sun rise over Brooklyn, realizing that the stench of failure had finally left the room, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of justice. The morning air in the city felt heavy with the promise of a coming storm as I made my way to a nondescript brick building in a forgotten corner of Long Island City, carrying the digital ruins of my father's empire in the inner pocket of my coat. To ensure that the 128 files I had unearthed were transformed from mere data into a lethal legal strike, I knew I needed more than just an auditor's eye. I needed a hunter. I had reached out to Marcus, a retired IRS Criminal Investigation Division specialist who had spent 32 years dismantling offshore tax havens and tracking the laundered proceeds of the city's most untouchable elites. We met in his basement office, a space that felt like a sanctuary of forgotten truths, smelling strongly of ozone, stale black coffee, and the heated plastic of old laserjet printers that hummed in the corners like restless ghosts. The room was illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a clinical, unforgiving light over stacks of manila folders and boxes of redacted bank statements. Marcus was a man who looked like he was carved out of New England granite, with eyes that had seen every trick in the book and hands that moved with a slow, deliberate patience. I sat across from his metal desk and handed him the encrypted Kingston Iron Key flash drive, the metal casing still cold from the morning air, and watched as he plugged it into a sanitized workstation that was disconnected from the outside world. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the basement was the rhythmic clicking of a mechanical keyboard and the occasional low grunt of recognition from Marcus as he navigated through the labyrinth of Blackwood Legal's fraudulent pro bono filings. I watched his face as he scrolled through the cross-referenced spreadsheets, his brow furrowing when he reached the section detailing the $812,000 discrepancy in the Public Defense Fund. He eventually leaned back in his creaking leather chair, the springs groaning under his weight, and removed his wire-rimmed glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "This is a career ender, Sierra," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. He wasn't just talking about a fine or a temporary suspension of a law license. He was looking at the documented evidence of systematic municipal fraud, grand larceny, and the violation of at least 4 federal statutes regarding the misappropriation of city funds. He explained that by overbilling the city for public defense work and diverting those funds to cover personal country club memberships and luxury firm retreats, my father hadn't just been greedy. He had been spectacularly stupid, leaving a digital trail that Marcus could turn into a roadmap for a grand jury. But the financial evidence was only one half of the arsenal I was assembling. The numbers would destroy the firm, but I needed something that would destroy the man. Through a contact in the event planning industry who had been mistreated by the Blackwood family for years, I managed to secure a raw 4K high-definition video recording from the Winter Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This wasn't the polished, edited version meant for the firm's social media. This was a hot mic recording from a secondary camera positioned near the VIP lounge area. The footage was hauntingly clear, capturing a moment that occurred shortly after my father's public speech. It showed Sterling Blackwood standing in a circle of his most influential donors, men who controlled the flow of capital in Manhattan, clutching a glass of 25-year-old Macallan. He was leaning in, his face flushed with the arrogance of power, and I watched in nauseating detail as he explicitly mocked Maya, a 5-year-old girl who had done nothing but exist and love her father. He laughed about her unfortunate upbringing, making cruel jokes about her modest clothes and the stench of her father's middle-class house, while the group of donors erupted in sycophantic laughter, their gold watches glinting in the camera light. Seeing that footage, hearing my father's voice call a child a charity case to a room full of laughing millionaires, solidified my resolve into something harder than diamond. The evidence was now a complete, multidimensional portrait of a man who was morally and professionally bankrupt. I had the raw numbers, the forensic analysis from a retired federal investigator, the devastating video footage that would ruin his reputation in the court of public opinion, and a notarized copy of the firm's secret ledger, a physical book that a disgruntled former bookkeeper had kept as insurance and had finally agreed to turn over to me. This ledger was the holy grail of my investigation, containing the handwritten notes that linked the digital fraud to my father's direct orders, proving that the $812,000 wasn't a clerical error but a calculated theft. Marcus and I spent the afternoon organizing the physical documents into a series of binders, each one tabbed and indexed according to the specific criminal codes they addressed. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched him stamp the pages, as if I were preparing a report for a client rather than the destruction of my own father. But then I would think of Julian's face when he looked at his bank balance after paying for a specialist, or Maya's small hand reaching for a crayon in their queen's kitchen, and the detachment would vanish, replaced by a searing, cold clarity. Marcus warned me that once we went to the district attorney's office, there would be no turning back, that my father would use every resource at his disposal, the private investigators, the high-priced defense attorneys, and the political favors he had spent decades collecting, to crush me. He looked at me over the stacks of paper and asked if I was prepared for the fallout, reminding me that the Blackwood name would become synonymous with scandal, and that my own career as an auditor might be scrutinized in the crossfire. I told him that I had already been disinherited at 10:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in front of 200 people, and that there was no social or financial standing left for me to lose that mattered more than my integrity. I was a corporate auditor who had finally found the one account that couldn't be settled with a check. The debt of a father who had traded his daughter for a legacy built on the backs of the poor. We finished the binders at sunset, the light fading from the basement office as Marcus locked them in a fireproof safe. The contrast between the ozone-scented basement and the mahogany-paneled suites of the Plaza Hotel was total, and it served as a reminder of where the truth actually lives. The truth isn't found in the speeches given at the Met or the $12,000 dresses worn by my mother. The truth is found in the grainy surveillance footage, the dry ledger entries, and the quiet, steady work of people like Marcus, who have spent their lives looking behind the curtain. I drove back to Brooklyn in my 2017 RAV4, the 94,000 miles on the engine feeling like a badge of endurance. I thought about the $3,200 monthly HOA fee my father paid just to live in a building that shielded him from the world he was stealing from. I thought about the way Paige smirked at her Cartier bracelets, unaware that the gold was essentially forged from the overbilled hours of public defenders in the Bronx. Every piece of luxury they owned was now tied, in my mind, to a specific file in my digital folder. The Brioni suits were paid for by the $812,000 stolen from the city. The McCallan was the liquid remains of a child's diverted resources. When I arrived home, the apartment was dark and quiet, the radiator clanking its familiar morning 6 a.m. rhythm even though it was late evening. I sat at my IKEA desk and looked at the empty space where my laptop had been while I was working. I felt a profound sense of closure. I wasn't just a victim of a cruel family meeting anymore. I was the architect of their accountability. I had secured the 4K proof of my father's inhumanity and the forensic proof of his criminality, and I had done it using the very tools he had provided me through my education and my brief time at his firm. He had trained me to be a weapon, and now that weapon was pointed directly at the heart of his empire. My name is Sierra Blackwood, and I am 27 years old, and while I may never inherit a $68,000 penthouse, I had something far more valuable, a dossier that proved that the real failure in the Blackwood family was the man who thought he could buy the world with stolen money. As I prepared for the meeting with the authorities the next morning, I knew that the storm was finally here, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the thunder. I was the one who had brought the lightning, and when the dust settled, the only thing left standing would be the truth that a 5-year-old girl's laughter is worth more than any legacy built on the ruin of others. I looked at the notarized ledger one last time, the ink dark and final, and I realized that the audit of Sterling Blackwood was officially complete, and the results were non-negotiable. The air inside my father's Park Avenue penthouse was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet, calculated hum of high-stakes social engineering as I stepped off the private elevator and into what he had termed an olive branch. They called it a pre-wedding rehearsal dinner, a formal gesture to make amends for the public execution at the gala. But I knew the architecture of my father's mind too well to believe in the sudden onset of his conscience. This was not a dinner. It was a trap, a meticulously staged event designed to lure me back into the fold just long enough to crush my spirit in front of a more intimate, influential crowd. There were 55 guests circulating through the 12-room sprawling estate, an assembly of Blackwood Legal's most prestigious clients, federal judges who played golf with my father at the Maidstone Club, and the kind of Manhattan elite who view poverty as a contagious disease. The catering alone had cost $18,500, a figure I knew because I had seen the invoice from Caviar Russe on the kitchen island, featuring a staff of 12 white-gloved servers moving through the room with trays of Wagyu beef carpaccio and gold-leafed blinis. The lighting was dimmed to a soft amber glow that made the mahogany walls gleam with an expensive, deceptive warmth, while a string quartet in the corner played a subdued arrangement of Vivaldi that felt more like a march to a gallows than a celebration of love. I arrived not in the emerald silk gown of a submissive heiress, but in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit from Theory that cost $1,200, a purchase made with my own hard-earned salary to signal that I was no longer a decorative asset of the Blackwood brand. In my hand, I carried a heavy stack of manila envelopes, their weight a comforting physical manifestation of the truth I was about to unleash. My father, Sterling Blackwood, stood at the center of the living room beneath a $6 million Rothko painting, looking every bit the patriarch in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He was holding a glass filled with Krug Clos d'Ambonnet champagne, a bottle that retails for over $400, and he was holding it like a scepter. I watched him from across the room as he checked his Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, the same clinical expression on his face that he used when he was about to deliver a closing argument that would ruin a man's life. He was preparing a toast, and I could see the practiced tilt of his head and the way he surveyed the room, waiting for the perfect moment of silence to deliver a speech that I knew would be peppered with backhanded compliments and subtle jabs at Julian's character, my poor judgment, and the unfortunate dilution of our family's noble lineage. The contrast between the $18,000 dinner and the $812,000 fraud I had documented in my envelopes was a physical weight in my chest. I moved through the crowd, nodding to partners I had known since I was a child, men who were currently drinking champagne paid for by the very city funds they had helped my father siphon away. I saw my mother, Beatrice, draped in a vintage Chanel gown, her neck adorned with a diamond lavalier that caught the light with every nervous sip of her drink. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and pleading, perhaps sensing that the daughter who had walked out of the Plaza Hotel was not the same woman who had entered the Penthouse tonight. I didn't stop to engage in the hollow small talk about summering in the Hamptons or the latest fluctuations in the bond market. Instead, I began to strategically place the manila envelopes on the antique side tables and the marble mantels, disguised as new firm brochures for the guests to peruse at their leisure. Each envelope contained a curated summary of the dossier Marcus and I had finalized, a surgical strike of information that included the 4K video stills of my father mocking Maya and the redacted ledger entries showing the systematic overbilling of the city's public defense fund. As the clock neared 8:30 p.m., the hour designated for the formal toast, the room began to quiet as my father tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the Vivaldi and the hushed whispers of 55 people who lived their lives in a bubble of unearned privilege. He stepped forward into the center of the rug, a lush Persian silk weave that cost more than Julian's 3-bedroom house in Queens, and began to speak with a voice that was smooth, resonant, and entirely fraudulent. He spoke of the importance of tradition, of the burdens of a legacy, and of his great hope that his daughter would eventually see the wisdom of protecting the family's vast interests. He looked directly at me, his eyes cold even as his lips curved into a theatrical smile, and I saw the moment he was about to transition into the humiliation phase of his performance. He began to mention Julian, calling him a talented but simple man who lacked the financial literacy to truly understand the world we occupied. And he mentioned Maya, his voice dripping with a fake patronizing pity as he spoke of her unfortunate start in life. The donors chuckled on cue, their expensive jewelry clinking as they shifted in their seats, oblivious to the fact that they were standing in a room built on a foundation of grand larceny. But before he could finish his sentence, I took a step forward, my voice steady and amplified by the absolute lack of fear in my heart. I didn't wait for him to stop. I interrupted the senior partner of Blackwood Legal in his own home in front of his biggest clients, and I told him that the only stench of failure in the room was the smell of the $812,000 he had stolen from the citizens of New York. A collective gasp rippled through the room, the kind of sound a crowd makes when they witness a catastrophic accident in slow motion. My father's face went from a practiced tan to a ghostly, mottled gray, his hand tightening around the $400 champagne glass until I thought the crystal might shatter. I didn't stop there. I directed the guests' attention to the manila envelopes I had distributed, informing them that they were holding a forensic audit of the firm's pro bono department. I told the federal judges in the room that they might be interested in page 4, which detailed the exact dates and times their public defense cases had been used as cover for my father's personal golf trips and luxury renovations. The hyper-reality of the moment was staggering. I noticed the way a drop of champagne spilled from my father's shaking glass and landed on his polished floor, and the way my sister Paige's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror, as she realized the Cartier bracelets on her arms were suddenly visible to the world as the proceeds of crime. The silence that followed my announcement was not the respectful silence of a toast. It was the suffocating, airless silence of a sinking ship. My father tried to regain his composure, his voice cracking as he called for security and told the guests that I was having a mental breakdown. But it was too late. Several of the major clients had already opened the envelopes, their eyes widening as they saw the notarized ledger entries and the technical breakdown of the fraud Marcus had helped me prepare. The 4K video of my father mocking a 5-year-old child was the final blow. As I played the audio from my phone into the room's high-end integrated speaker system, the sound of his cruel laughter filled the penthouse, stripping away the last vestige of his cultivated dignity. Standing there in my $1,200 suit, I realized that the trap he had set for me had become his own cage. He had invited the elite of Manhattan to witness my submission, but instead, they were witnessing his downfall. I looked at the $18,500 spread of food that no one was eating anymore, and I felt a profound sense of justice for Julian and Maya. Every dollar spent on this dinner was a dollar that should have been used to provide legal defense for people who couldn't afford a $68,000 penthouse. I watched as the federal judges quietly set down their drinks and made for the exit, their faces stony and professional, knowing that their association with Sterling Blackwood was now a career liability. The clients followed, leaving in a frantic, hushed exodus that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a storm. Within 10 minutes, the grand living room was empty of everyone except my family and the silent catering staff who were already beginning to clear the untouched Wagyu beef. My father stood alone under his Rothko, a broken king in a hollow castle, the bottle of Krug still sweating on the mahogany table next to him. He didn't look at me. He looked at the empty room, finally realizing that a legacy built on theft and cruelty has no standing when the truth is audited. I walked toward the elevator, the stack of leftover envelopes tucked under my arm, and I didn't feel the need to say a final goodbye. The audit was closed, the findings were public, and the debt he owed to the city and to me was finally being called in. I stepped out of the penthouse and into the cool night air of Park Avenue, where my 2017 RAV4 was parked 3 blocks away because I refused to pay for the building's valet service. As I drove back toward Brooklyn, toward the 600-square-foot walk-up where Julian and Maya were waiting for me, I realized that the real inheritance wasn't the money or the name. It was the freedom to look at myself in the mirror and know that I had done the right thing. The Blackwood dynasty was over, ending not with a bang but with the quiet, devastating click of an auditor's pen. And for the first time in 27 years, I was going home to a family that didn't need a strategy meeting or a risk assessment report to know that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Standing in the rubble of my father's pride, I saw the clear, bright future of a life built on integrity, and as the Manhattan skyline faded in my rearview mirror, I knew that the stench of failure had finally been replaced by the scent of a clean conscience and the promise of a morning where the numbers finally added up to the truth. I stood in the center of the vast living room, the gold-leafed ceiling of the Park Avenue penthouse seeming to press down on the 55 elite guests like the weight of a coming storm, and I chose that exact moment of artificial serenity to shatter the Blackwood legacy forever. My father, Sterling Blackwood, had just reached the crescendo of his patronizing toast, his $400 glass of Krug champagne raised high as he prepared to deliver the final crushing blow to my reputation. But I stepped forward and interrupted him with a voice that was as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "Father, you always taught me that the law is not about the grand speeches or the mahogany furniture, but about the fine print," I said, my words echoing through the marble hallway and bouncing off the $6 million Rothko with a resonance that made the string quartet stop playing mid-measure. I began to move through the crowd with the clinical efficiency of a professional auditor, systematically handing out the heavy manila envelopes to the men and women who held the keys to the city's financial and legal power. I told them that since we were all gathered here to celebrate the future of the Blackwood name, we should take a moment to look at the actual fine print of Blackwood Legal's 2024 tax returns and their municipal pro bono filings. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that precedes a building's collapse, as the managing partner of Sterling's biggest corporate client, a man who controlled a $3 billion hedge fund, tore open his envelope, and his jaw literally dropped in a display of genuine, unvarnished shock. I didn't wait for them to digest the numbers in private. I stood my ground on the hand-woven silk rug and began to read out the exact figures from the summary memorandum Marcus and I had prepared, my voice steady as I detailed the $812,450 in fraudulent billings that had been siphoned from the city's public defense fund. I watched the color drain from my father's face, leaving it the shade of old parchment, as I explained how those funds, meant to provide legal representation for the indigent, had instead been diverted to pay for the very $18,000 catering spread they were currently consuming and the country club memberships that allowed my father to rub shoulders with federal judges. To ensure the destruction was total, I reached into my pocket and activated the remote trigger for the apartment's integrated Bose surround sound system, which I had synced to my phone minutes earlier. Suddenly, the air was filled not with Vivaldi, but with the raw, high-definition audio of my father's own voice from the gala, amplified to a deafening volume that made it impossible for anyone to look away. The guests stood frozen as they heard him laugh and call 5-year-old Maya dead weight, his voice dripping with a casual, aristocratic cruelty as he mocked a child's existence to a group of sycophants. The sound was so jarringly at odds with the elegant surroundings that it felt like a physical assault, and in the middle of the recording, a prominent district attorney dropped his crystal glass of reserve Pinot Noir. The glass shattered with a melodic ring, and the dark red liquid spread rapidly across the $40,000 cream-colored Persian rug, creating a jagged crimson stain that looked exactly like a fresh crime scene. The hyper-realism of the moment was visceral. I could smell the metallic tang of the spilled wine, and the scent of expensive perfume turned sour by the sudden spike of adrenaline in the room. I looked at the managing partner, who was still staring at the line item for margin optimization, and I saw the moment he realized that his own firm's reputation was now tethered to a sinking ship. My father was no longer a king. He was a defendant in waiting, his bespoke tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume as the people he had spent decades courting began to back away from him as if he were radioactive. I continued to speak, detailing the specific shell codes and the altered invoices, naming the dates when senior partners were in the Hamptons while billing the city for 12-hour days in a Bronx courtroom. I made sure to mention that a notarized copy of the firm's secret ledger was already in the hands of a retired IRS investigator, and that a digital copy of everything in their hands had been sent to the district attorney's office at exactly 8:15 p.m. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic drip of the red wine from the mahogany table onto the ruined silk rug. My mother, Beatrice, had sunk into a velvet armchair, her hand clutched over her diamond lavalier as if it could protect her from the sudden poverty of her social standing, while my sister Paige stared at her $9,000 Cartier bracelets with a look of dawning horror, finally understanding that her luxury was the collateral for my father's crimes. I felt a profound sense of clarity as I surveyed the wreckage of the Blackwood family's carefully curated facade, realizing that I had used the very precision and ruthlessness my father had instilled in me to dismantle the empire he had built on lies. I didn't feel the need for a dramatic exit or a final insult. The numbers and the audio clip had done the work for me, providing a forensic accounting of a soul that was fundamentally bankrupt. Every guest in that room was a witness now, and every manila envelope was a nail in the coffin of Blackwood Legal's 30-year history. I watched as the managing partner whispered something to his associates and turned toward the elevator without a word to my father, a signal that the $3 billion account was officially closed. The exodus began in earnest then, a silent, panicked retreat of the city's elite, leaving behind their half-empty glasses of Krug and their plates of Wagyu beef as they fled the scene of a reputation's murder. As I turned to leave, I looked at the red stain on the rug one last time, a permanent reminder that the cost of my father's legacy was a debt that could never be repaid with money. I walked toward the elevator, the charcoal suit I had bought with my own salary feeling like armor, and as the doors slid shut on the silent, ruined penthouse, I knew that the audit of my life was finally balanced. I was no longer the disinherited daughter or the charity case. I was the woman who had looked into the fine print of a dynasty and found the courage to tell the truth. The long night of the Blackwood family was over, and as I stepped out onto Park Avenue and walked toward my 2017 Rave 4, I felt the first breath of a morning that belonged entirely to me, to Julian, and to a little girl whose value could never be calculated by a man who didn't know the meaning of the word family. The fallout from the rehearsal dinner was absolute, a catastrophic chain reaction that dismantled the Blackwood dynasty with a speed and ferocity that even my meticulous auditing skills hadn't fully predicted. Within 72 hours of those manila envelopes being opened, the State Bar of New York officially opened a formal investigation into the professional conduct of Sterling Blackwood and the senior leadership of Blackwood Legal, triggered by the undeniable evidence of municipal fraud and the misappropriation of public defense funds. The mahogany halls of the firm, once hushed with the sound of high-stakes deals and expensive shoes, were suddenly flooded with investigators from the district attorney's office and forensic accountants from the city's Department of Finance, who hauled away thousands of boxes of physical files and terabytes of digital data in the full view of the Manhattan press. My father, the man who once believed he was untouchable, was forced into an immediate and humiliating early retirement, a euphemism that fooled absolutely no one in the legal community. To avoid a protracted trial and the very real possibility of a 10-year prison sentence in a federal penitentiary, he was compelled to sign a settlement agreement that required him to pay $1,200,000 in fines, back taxes, and direct restitution to the city's indigent legal fund. The $68,000 Park Avenue penthouse, with its $3,200 monthly HOA fee and its pristine marble floors, was listed for sale within the week to cover the mounting legal fees and the massive financial penalties that stripped him of his liquid assets. The social collapse was just as swift and merciless as the financial one, proving that the elite circles my parents inhabited were built on the shifting sands of status rather than the solid rock of loyalty. My mother, Beatrice, who had spent decades meticulously cultivating her image as a grand dame of New York society, found herself radioactive. Her invitations to the Met Gala and the various charity boards she chaired were quietly rescinded via cold, two-sentence emails from administrative assistants. She eventually moved to their significantly smaller two-bedroom retirement house in a quiet, gated community in Naples, Florida, a place she had once mocked as a dumping ground for the uninspired, where she now spends her days in a forced anonymity that is her own private version of hell. My sister Paige's socialite status, which she had worn like a crown of thorns over everyone she deemed beneath her, vanished overnight as her friends, The same women who had admired her $9,000 Cartier bracelets blocked her number and excluded her from the bridal showers and yacht trips that were the oxygen of her existence. The Blackwood name, once a symbol of power and untouchable prestige, became a cautionary tale whispered in the back of town cars and a punchline in the very legal tabloids my father had once manipulated to his advantage. In the midst of this wreckage, my own life began to bloom with a quiet, authentic beauty that didn't require a six-figure budget or a mahogany podium to justify itself. 2 weeks after the collapse of the Blackwood Empire, I married Julian in a small, intimate ceremony held at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, a choice that felt like a deliberate act of healing. The venue cost exactly $4,000, and the air was filled with the scent of real cherry blossoms and damp earth instead of cloying funeral lilies and expensive perfume. There were only 30 guests, people who had stood by us when we had nothing, including Marcus, who watched the ceremony with a rare, stoic smile of satisfaction. I didn't wear a $24,000 Vera Wang gown. I wore a simple, elegant ivory dress I bought off the rack for $800, and I have never felt more beautiful or more certain of my place in the world. Julian stood at the altar, his hands no longer stained with the dirt of his work, but trembling slightly with an emotion that my father would never be able to comprehend. And as I walked toward him, I realized that the value of a man is not measured by his credit score or the brand of his suit, but by the depth of his devotion to the people he loves. The most profound moment of the day, and perhaps of my entire life, came when it was time for Maya to fulfill her role as the flower girl. Instead of a traditional basket of petals, she walked down the aisle holding a sign she had spent the previous evening drawing herself with a set of 36 Crayola markers on a piece of heavy poster board. In her messy 5-year-old handwriting, surrounded by hand-drawn hearts and lopsided sunflowers, she had written, "I finally have a real family." A guest captured the moment on their phone, a raw, unedited clip of a little girl in a $20 Target dress beaming with a joy that was pure and untainted by the cynicism of Park Avenue, and uploaded it to TikTok. Within 48 hours, the video had garnered over 8 million views, becoming a viral sensation that resonated with millions of people who had felt the sting of being cast aside by toxic relatives. The comments section became a digital monument to the truth, with strangers from all over the world cheering for a little girl and a woman who had dared to stand up to a legacy of cruelty. That video, more than any audit or legal filing, effectively buried the Blackwood name forever, replacing the image of the cold, aristocratic firm with the image of a child who finally felt safe and seen. I am now Sierra Blackwood Reed, and for the first time in my 27 years, I can look at the ledger of my life and see that my books are finally perfectly balanced. I still drive my 2017 Toyota RAV4, which now has 96,000 miles on it, and we still live in our Brooklyn walk-up where the radiator clanks and the stairs groan. But our home is filled with a warmth that $68 million could never buy. I continue my work as a corporate auditor, but I do it with a newfound sense of purpose, knowing that the fine print is often where the most important truths are hidden. Julian's landscape business is thriving, not because of family connections or bribes, but because he treats every garden he designs as a living testament to the beauty of growth and resilience. We are saving for a college fund for Maya, contributing $500 a month to a 529 plan, a modest sum that represents a future built on honesty rather than theft. My father reached out to me once from Florida, a desperate, rambling letter asking for a loan to help cover his remaining legal debts. But I didn't reply. I simply filed the letter away in a folder labeled Closed Accounts and went back to helping Maya with her first-grade math homework. The journey from the Temple of Dender to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden was paved with the ruins of a dynasty, but it was the only path that led to my own soul. I had to bankrupt a toxic relative's ego, dismantling a 40-year empire of greed and arrogance just to find the peace that comes from living a life that is fundamentally and unapologetically real. I realized that family isn't a collection of assets to be managed or a bloodline to be protected at the cost of one's humanity. Family is the people who show up for the rehearsal dinner of your life, not because of the Krug champagne, but because they want to make sure you're not standing alone when the lights go out. My father thought he was disinheriting me at 10:14 p.m. on that cold December night, but he was actually giving me the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to stop being a Blackwood and start being myself. The $812,000 he stole is gone. The Park Avenue penthouse belongs to a hedge fund manager from London, and the name Blackwood Legal has been scrubbed from the lobby of its glass tower. But the lesson remains. You cannot audit a heart, and you cannot put a price on the moment a 5-year-old girl looks at you and sees her entire world. My books are balanced, my conscience is clear, and as I sit at my IKEA desk tonight, watching the moon rise over the Brooklyn Bridge, I know that I am finally, undeniably, home. The moral of this story is that dignity isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn by refusing to participate in the lies of people who think their bank account entitles them to your soul. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out and who is willing to help you carry the weight of the fine print until the numbers finally add up to love. I found my worth in the silence between the numbers, in the dirt of a queen's garden, and in the laughter of a child who was never a charity case, but a miracle. The Blackwood legacy is dead, and in its place, something far more durable has been planted. A life that is small, ordinary, and beautiful beyond measure. I am Sierra Blackwood Reed, and I have finally learned that the most important audit you will ever perform is the one that tells you exactly who you are when you have nothing left to lose but your name.